Hey y'all, welcome back to Sewing with Sin. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to be working on the Casita Dress, which is a CriswoodSews pattern. And before we get into it, I just have a few notes to share with you about some changes that I made.
Okay, so I wanted you to see the Casita dress according to the pattern and how she envisioned it. The back bottom panel has gatherings, and then the front is straight across. So the front is a little bit more fitted than the back, and I've made this pattern before, and I decided this time around I wanted to have gathering all along the entire dress. So my panel in the front is going to be significantly wider. So that's just something to note that I've changed for my pattern. If you have never sewed any of Chris Wood's patterns, you're in for a treat because they're almost zero waste. They're not actual pattern pieces like you might be used to. So I'm looking down right now, and on page 4 of her instructions, you end up arriving with a pattern piece by taking all of your measurements. So you're gonna go through the list of measurements that she wants you to take, and then you use these formulas to plug in your measurements. That will give you the width and the length of the panel pieces. And what's really cool is that all of the panel pieces for this dress are square or rectangular. I want to say also with her pattern, the envelope dress, it's the same thing. So you would take measurements, plug in the measurements, and you would have rectangular pieces that you put together. That's one way to achieve very little waste, is using rectangular and square pieces like this. So on page 6, she has a pattern layout, and she gives examples of different widths of fabrics. And in her examples, she's laying out the fabric flat. For me and for my measurements, what worked was folding the fabric in half and cutting my pieces that way. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that that's also a way that you can cut these pattern pieces. So on page 14 of her instructions, this is the part where you're inserting the cuff of the sleeve into the armhole. I'm telling you now up front that I sewed that in wrong, and you'll see me work through those adjustments because I love leaving those kinds of mistakes in my sew-alongs. That way you can learn from my mistakes. But I just wanted to throw that out there to pay really careful attention to how you sew in the cuff. That way there's no bunching or pinching in the underarm seam. Okay, I think that's it for now. Let's get sewing.
Now, just like I mentioned, you're going to use your measurements to enter them into the formulas on page 4 in her pattern instructions. And then those formulas are going to give you these pattern pieces that you'll need. So that includes this square neck piece and the yoke, the arm cuffs, and the pocket piece. And for the pocket piece, I'm just using a pocket pattern that I already have for my own pattern, but you can cut the formula that she recommended if you choose. Oh, and just a quick note that I'm choosing to cut my skirt directly on the fabric. That way I don't waste too much of my paper. And the rest of my pattern pieces, I'm going to lay on my folded piece of fabric. I think I have a 54-inch fabric, and I want the direction of these stripes to be horizontal for the top of the bodice, but I want the skirt to be vertical. So I just had to do a little bit of testing with my pattern pieces to see how I was going to place everything. And in her instructions on page 6, she shows you different ways of how you can lay out these pattern pieces. That way you're not wasting barely any fabric. Like, this is a almost zero waste pattern. And of course, it depends on your measurements and the width of your fabric, how you're going to lay everything out. So I'm just showing you mine for an example, of course. Here is the rest of my fabric, and I'm using this for the 2 panels of the skirt. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm using the back panel in the front as well. So all I have to do is cut this piece of fabric in half. They're going to be the exact same width. But if you're following the pattern as is, your front panel width is going to be significantly more narrow than the back panel. So I'm just going to cut this in half, and I'm ready to start working on the next step. Oops, I forgot, I still have one more pattern piece. I didn't cut that neck facing, so there it is right there. And then this is the leftover fabric that I had, just a little bit. It's perfect. I love this pattern because you're really wasting very little. And then that is waste. I'm going to have to throw that away. Okay, moving on to the neck piece. I love this part. I am on page 7 right now, and we fold it down, and then we fold that top corner down to the right corner, and the open part of this triangle should be on the bottom. And then I'm going to use my ruler to help me because we're going to measure out 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters from the lower edge, and then we're just going to cut that off. And now we have a facing and an inner square. Isn't that so cool? I love that we're creating the pattern pieces as we go instead of a typical standard pattern piece that would already have been drafted for you. So that's what I love about this pattern. Okay, so here's the facing. That's what it looks like. And then that's the next piece that we're going to use in just a little bit. Just kidding. We're going to use that neck piece right now. Okay, we fold it in half. And you can cut that in half. I guess you don't necessarily have to cut it, but I'm just following all her instructions so I don't confuse you. So we're cutting this in half, and then we're going to use this to create the neck opening on that yoke piece that we have. And then we fold it in half lengthwise and just snip a little piece or mark the center point on one side or both sides. Now I'm gonna mark the center point on both sides of my yolks as well. So I'm just folding it in half, adding a little snip, or you can mark it with a marker, a fabric marker of course, and do the same for the other piece. Now you're gonna lay that neck piece and match those center points and then pin it in place. I'm doing one yoke at a time. You can do them both together if you want. To be safe, I'm doing one at a time. And then I'm going to cut around that little rectangle to create my neck opening. And then I'm going to repeat the same thing for the opposite yoke. Okay, now it's starting to come together. I'm going to pin the shoulder pieces together, right sides together. And we'll sew those shoulder seams at, what is it, a half an inch? Oh, 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. So I'm going to go and do that. Ta-da, it's sewn. Oops, I forgot to show you that step on my machine, but you'll just make sure to finish those seams. And we also need our facing to match our neckline. So we sewed that at 3/8 of an inch, and so we're going to fold our facing in half with right sides together. And I'm just pinning it along the folded side. And we're going to sew that at 3/8 of an inch. It needs to match the neckline, so that's why we're sewing this down. So I'm sewing that at 3/8 of an inch, and I think I'm also going to be showing you that on my machine. So when you open it, you'll see that everything will line up nicely. Okay, here we go. Please excuse the background fan. It's really hot. It's summer over here, so although I love hearing the sound of the machine, the sewing machine, I do not love the sound of the fan in the background. So we're going to sew that, remember, at a 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter, and then we're going to cut open those seams so they can lay flat. And you can just use your finger to press those seams open. You don't really need to iron that. And the last step with this neck facing is we're going to finish all around with a serger or a zigzag stitch. And here's what that should look like. And maybe you can learn from my mistake. When I was putting it through the serger, I wasn't very careful. And oops, one side is not open. So it's not a big deal, but just pay attention to that. And now we're going to attach with our right sides together. So the right side of the facing to the right side of your yoke. You're going to pin the seams, match the seams of the shoulder to the seams of the facing, and then just pin it all the way around. And we're going to sew that down. Now, I'd say this step is a little tricky, mainly because it's kind of hard to gauge 3/8 of an inch on your machine when you're reaching the corner parts and when you're pivoting. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So right here, I'm starting at the shoulder seam, and I'm going to sew that at 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. And I'm going all the way down pretty close to that corner. And it's just a little hard to gauge what is 3/8 of an inch when you're going down right there. So you won't really know until you pivot it. So when I pivot it right here, I can see it doesn't exactly line up to 3/8 of an inch. And so I have to pivot it back. And so I think I had to do like one stitch more to be exactly accurate. You really do want that to be accurate, otherwise your neckline's not going to be even across your body. So just take your time, go really slow. You might need to add a stitch or take away a stitch when you're getting to these corner pieces. And here's what that should look like. Now we're going to get some really sharp scissors and snip into the corner. Be really careful that you don't accidentally snip into the stitches that you just sewed. Okay, now we want the facing to go to the wrong side of the bodice. So you're going to press towards the facing. I already did that step, and now I'm just folding it over and pinning it in place. So right now what you're looking at is the wrong side of the yoke. And I'm just pinning down the rest of the facing, and then we're going to stitch that down in place. Alrighty, we're edge stitching this in place now, and I really love it when pattern makers remind you when to put a label in your garment. On page 9, she reminds you that. I will be putting mine on the outside of my garment though, so I'm not going to do that, but just a reminder. And then you're just going to edge stitch it all the way around, and we're moving on. All right, here's what the top yoke piece looks like finished. And now we're going to be moving on to the bottom panel skirts. Let's take that top yoke piece and fold it in half and mark that center point. You're going to do that for the front panel and the back panel. And you're going to do the same thing to your skirt panels. Just fold it in half lengthwise and mark the center point. Okay, now we're going to be gathering this skirt up. I am on page 10 right now in the instructions. Don't forget to pull long threads. Do not backstitch when you're gathering. And use a long stitch length to gather your fabric. And I'm going to be a little lazy, and I'm just going to do one row at 1/4 of an inch. It's always recommended to do 2 rows just to get even gathers, but I'm just taking a few shortcuts here. So again, you can add another row or move on from here, and you're going to repeat the same thing for the opposite panel. And I attached one skirt already just so you can see what it looks like when it's finished. And now we're going to do it on the opposite side. So here's the opposite yoke. I have right side facing up, and then I'm going to take my skirt panel and I'm going to match that center point of the skirt panel to the center point of the yoke and pin that in place. And then I'm going to pin the edge of the skirt to the edge of the yoke pieces. And you're going to distribute all the gathers evenly between those 2 sections right there. And when you're finished, pin it all in place. So you know how I only sewed 1 row of gathering stitches? I'm realizing now that when I have to distribute these gathers, it takes a little bit longer, so I probably didn't actually save any time. And we're sewing the skirt onto the bodice panel now at 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. And I just thought now was a good time to try it on, check the fit. I pinned the underarm seam in place just to make sure that it was roomy enough before I start adding the cuffs and closing that seam right there. Everything feels good. And I'm adding an additional step. It's not in the instruction, but this is something I always do. You're going to press those seams up and add a top stitch to the bodice, and that just secures that extra seam allowance. And it also looks really nice from the front. So I'm just doing that really quick before I move on to the side seams. Okay, we're gonna start adding some more markings on our dress to add the cuff and the pockets. So it says calculate half the length of the cuff, then subtract 3/4 of an inch. And that measurement is going to mark from the shoulder seam, and that's going to be our arm opening. So I did my measurements and wrote it all out, and now I'm just marking where my underarm seam is going to be, and do it on the opposite side as well. And then we measure down from that point 7.5 inches. I think I did mine slightly higher, maybe 6.5 or 7, because I have a very short torso and I like my pockets to be a little bit higher up. So you might want to just check the placement of your pockets before you do that measurement. And then we're going to pin our pockets in place. Then with our pockets right sides together, you're going to stitch that raw edge down at 3/8 inch, 1 centimeter on all 4 pockets. Now we're going to finish the raw edge of that entire side panel of the skirt, starting from the bottom all the way across, all the way through the shoulder seam, all the way to the opposite side of the skirt. And you're doing that on both sides. Okay, I forgot to show you, but what I did was I pressed the pocket seam out towards the pocket, and now I'm adding a top stitch. So you're going to do that on all of your pocket pieces. Now with right sides together, you're going to pin and place those side seams. So I'm matching the seam where the skirt is at. I'm making sure that those line up, and then I'm also adding a clip, or you can pin in place where the underarm seam was. Remember that mark that you made earlier? Make sure that everything is lining up when you're pinning the side seams together. Then I like to move down to the pocket piece and make sure that the top of the pocket is lining up perfectly, and do the same to the bottom part of the pocket. Then I just move down the rest of the skirt panel, pinning that in place, and I'm going to go back to the outside of the pocket and pin all of that in place. And we're going to start at that arm marking all the way down. So we're stitching that in place at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I'm leaving that top part open because that's going to be the arm opening. And I'm starting at the marking that I made earlier. And for me, that mark is just above the seam where the skirt panel meets. So I'm doing a couple of back stitches because that part right there is going to get a lot of wear and tear. And then just go all the way down and around your pocket, down to the bottom of the skirt, and repeat it for the opposite side. Y'all, I hope you don't make the same mistake I did. I forgot to finish my seams of my pocket in a prior step. So you should do that before. I'm gonna have to do that now, and that's okay too. We're so close, we're almost finished. All right, with the right sides together, you're going to fold it in half lengthwise and pin it in place. And we're going to stitch that seam closed at a 3/8 inch seam allowance again. Okay, now we're going to press our seams open. Again, I like to just finger press, and then you're going to fold with wrong sides together. So this is the right side of the cuff. I'm going to line up those seams and pin it in place. Now, I didn't finish the seam on my cuff yet because I want to just put it into the arm opening to make sure that everything fits nicely. I was a little unsure that it was going to fit in there, and so I'm just doing a quick test before I actually finish the seams and sew it in there. So I would suggest that too, just because I was a little unsure of my measurements. And if you're making this for the first time, you might want to just do a quick check. It's better to be safe than sorry. And also, putting a cuff into a sleeve can be a little fiddly. And I think for me personally, it's just really good practice being patient and really finessing that in there. You're not really supposed to be stretching fabric to fit in there. So I'm just kind of wiggling things around. And it turns out everything fit perfectly. So I finished the seam on that cuff. And we're inserting the cuff into the dress with right sides together, and make sure to match the shoulder seam with the seam of that cuff. Pin that in place first, and then again you're going to gently finesse and wiggle that cuff and pin everything in place. Now we're going to stitch it into the sleeve. And here is where I did not pay attention to her instructions. On page 14, she has an image where she tells you to start at the underarm seam, go all the way around, and end at the underarm seam. I did not look at that, and I started at the shoulder seam instead of the underarm seam. And when I reached this point right here, I really struggled to figure out how am I going to sew around or over that side seam because it's kind of bulky right there. And I'm going to show you in just a second what it ended up looking like when I didn't follow her directions. So right here, it just looks really pinched and like a weird pucker right in that underarm where all of the seams are meeting. And I didn't even bother to look at her instructions to figure out like what's going on. I just was looking and examining the garment and trying to figure out why is it so weird right there. I know that the seams are supposed to be pressed out towards the cuff, so I did that thinking that maybe it would fix that problem. It did not fix the problem. It's still really weird and puckered. As you can see, after I iron it, it still has like a little weird pucker right there. So I decided I'm going to need to redo this. I snipped some threads, tried to loosen it a little bit, and I was just trying to problem solve. And it wasn't until probably like 15 minutes later that I realized, oh, I should probably look at her instructions to see if she says anything about this. And of course, she does. So really pay attention to that. And here I am doing it again. This is for the opposite cuff. I'm starting at the underarm, going all the way around and ending right at the other side. And let me show you how much better it turns out when you follow instructions. Here it is. Everything lays nice and flat. There's no puckering, no pinching. So I tried it on because I was going to be lazy and not redo that cuff. But after putting it on, I can totally see the difference. Let me show you. The right side, this first side that I'm showing you, is the pinched one. And I just realized I need to do it again. So I went back and did it again. And it ended up turning out so much better just redoing that cuff. Oh. Thanks for joining me on my sew along. If you found this video helpful, I hope you'll like and subscribe for future sew alongs.